When I think of the war on terror, I think of three main aspects of the war. The first one being Guantanamo Bay Prison, which is still open despite promises to close it, and still has some 90 men incarcerated without charge or trial and without access to due process. This is a blight on the conscience of humanity. The second aspect of the war on terror is the aggressive counterterrorism legislation, which has taken foot in Britain and in the United States, as well as now increasingly in Europe and Australia. It is this counterterrorism legislation that has seen the houses of Muslims raided, people interrogated and arrested without charge, interrogated without lawyers. It has seen children taken away from their parents, and it has seen small crimes, small issues, activism, such as activism for the Palestinian cause, religious decisions such as deciding to wear a hijab, or discussions of jihad. These have all become suspicious acts in terms of the authorities in Britain. Even though this legislation is not working, as we can see by the increase in political violence around the world, it is now increasingly being adopted in many countries throughout the world. And this is where Cage Africa comes in. It is our remit to preempt any counterterrorism legislation that is going to take foot in South Africa, as well as to raise awareness of the human rights abuses that have taken place as a result of counterterrorism legislation in Africa. We have seen counterterrorism legislation used against political opponents, against human rights activists, and against journalists in countries such as Kenya and further afield, Ethiopia as well. The counterterrorism industry, which sells security and surveillance products to African nations, is also enjoying a great boom at the moment. In Uganda, a British firm recently sold surveillance software to the government in the name of countering terrorism. This surveillance software was then used to spy on political opponents in the recent general election. In Kenya, Britain continues to train the country's brutal counterterrorism police, well known for kidnapping and torture. And in Somalia, a recent drone attack by the US killed over 100 people, which the US termed militants, without giving the world any proof or any documentation of the processes behind the strike. And this brings me to the third aspect of the war on terror, drones and the so-called targeted killings of the US in Africa. CAGE stands for an end to all extrajudicial killings. We stand for the right of all to a fair trial. Drone killings bring us no closer to ending the cycles of violence that typify the war on terror, and yet the US is building an increasing number of drone bases in Africa in what can only be described as a kind of post-colonial invasion of the continent. South Africa's own legislation around drones, recently adopted and opposed by CAGE, opens the door in this country to the use of weaponized drones as well as surveillance drones. These three facets of the war on terror are a cause for some fear and loss of hope. However, we at CAGE believe that victory lies not in fear of these things or in loss of hope, but in standing up against them and in documenting them, speaking out against them, and most of all, supporting those who survive them, while fear is reserved for Allah and Allah alone. It is to this end that we honour our two guests today, Asim Qureshi, the Research Director of CAGE, and Sheikh Abdul Salam Zayev, former ambassador of the Afghanistan Taliban government and former Guantanamo Bay prisoner.